innovation in disaster recovery, where we're looking at how do you foster social inclusion through culture in city reconstruction and recovery. Now, why are we focusing on cities? We all know that the world is urbanizing at a rate that's faster than ever before. We expect that we're going to move from a situation where a little more than half of the world lives in cities now to something like 2/3 of the world in 2050. And with that comes massive development of infrastructure, massive investment and concentration of wealth in cities, but also massive risk, because those people who have just moved to cities and are in precarious situations, and all of that wealth is increasingly exposed to disasters of various types. So that, compounded with the increase in the frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters, makes us very concerned. We're not only talking, though, about disaster risk, we're also talking about the need for reconstruction after conflict. And so we see that conflict increasingly leads to the destruction of cities and threatens cultural heritage as well. So we know also that cities are not just a collection of buildings and infrastructure, but that they are living, breathing mechanisms and systems. And they're bound together by the culture that they represent. So in a sense, culture is the foundation of urban life. And to explore this in a little bit more depth and think about what tools we have, what approaches we have to incorporate culture for social inclusion in the process of both post-disaster and post-conflict recovery, we have a dynamic duo of a team from the World Bank and UNESCO. So we have Same Waba, who is the World Bank's director for both urban and resilience work, including disaster risk management. And we have Lazar Lundu from UNESCO. And they will be teaming up to talk about something called the CURE framework and the role of culture in post-crisis recovery. Then we'll go to representatives from a region that has gone through the rapid urbanization process, East Asia and the Pacific, and we'll have speakers from countries where culture and recovery are critical, but at different levels of economic development. So we have Setsuko Saya from the Cabinet Office in Japan, who will be talking about reconstruction and culture in Japan itself, and taking a very specific example to share with us. And then we have Texan John Lim from the Philippines, who will be talking about how in a couple of different cases in the Philippines this is being undertaken. And he has a quite extensive video to share with us. Hopefully we'll get a chance to see it all, but we may just hit the highlights. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Lazar and Same for their remarks.
Good afternoon to all, and thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. This is going to be a two-brains presentation, or call it a two-heads presentation between Same Waba and myself. In fact, what we would like to present to you is our joint position paper called Culture and City Reconstruction and Recovery. And I think it's important probably to just first say that, of course, I will explain a little bit about the why we came to this position paper, its objectives, and the context in which we are doing this work and this reflection, and then the framework that we put in place, and the rest will be presented by Sam. That's the reason why I said it's a two-brain presentation. I think what is important, how did we come up with this decision to join our efforts? It's because we are convinced that culture matters for cities. In a way, when we ask ourselves, we have been collaborating together in many different places and working together. So we came to the understanding and try to understand really in the best way why culture is critical to ensure an effective and post-crisis city reconstruction and recovery. In fact, when one analyzes the dynamics in cities, it becomes obvious that culture has always been the foundation upon which cities are built. And I think we see it everywhere. One also understands that cities, of course, are not just a collection of buildings put one next to another. But cities are made of people with their stories and also how they interact each other, how the different communities in a city interact each other through their cultural identity, through their landmarks, their cultural landmarks, and even through the sense of the place and what some of these places mean to them. And we see it everywhere. We see it in different places. We see it in Geneva here. We see it even in some of the places that are also, you know, we see it in Kathmandu, like you can see in the picture. We see it in Timbuktu. We see it in Alep, in different places. In fact, we came to that shared vision, which then led to the decision to have a position paper. So it's not something that we invented in a way, but it's simply because already having our two organizations share the same vision, I think it's great. And we were trying to just, you know, try to put this together because culture aspect, we realized that they cannot be left out, since of course they are critical to any, I would say, sustainable reconstruction and recovery. So based on this belief, we elaborated, like I said, this position paper to propose what we call an enhanced culture-based framework for city reconstruction and recovery post-crisis, which tries to integrate both people-centered and place-based approaches. So, let me say a little bit more about the context of this work. I think the data that we were able to gather from the World Bank are quite self-explanatory, in the sense that we all agree, and we've been discussing it for many years, and we see it. We see the how do you call it, the rapid urbanizing of the world in a speed and scale that is becoming almost unprecedented in our human history. And what the data collected by the World Bank tell us is of course that 55% of the global population today live in cities, and it is expected that by 2050 we might have, I would say, around 70%. And of course, such rapid urbanization, it's unfortunately sometimes accompanied by an increase of frequency and intensity of natural hazard, and Joe mentioned it already, that sometimes disproportionate impact on the urban areas, and we have many examples. One other information which also was very important to take into consideration was the fact that today, I mean, we can say that more than 200 million people are affected by natural hazards. each year with storms, floods, and earthquakes, which are increasing considerably in recent years as a result of climate change. The data also that the World Bank was able to get says that by 2030, it is estimated that a disaster will cost cities around the world some $340 billion in annual damages and losses. So this figure is the double of the average of the last 15 years. And this is very important. But it's not only about natural hazard. At the same time, we see armed conflicts are really becoming increasingly complex, involving not only state actors, but also interstate actors, and causing a wide, let's say, spread destruction in cities. I just came back from Mosul last week, and I can tell you that it's really devastating. In fact, when you visit some of these cities, you realize that armed conflict, have always had really a kind of devastating effect on culture, particularly on culture, including, when you try to see intentional destructions of people's collective memories and the tarnishing of symbols representing their cultural identities. In the last, I will say, decades, we could also observe that culture has been increasingly targeted as a means, sometimes of erasing people's tie to their communities. In fact, then people have to leave. And a similar targeted act of destruction are undertaken sometimes also to deliberately erase cultural diversity and pluralism, just to deny some of the victims their cultural rights and fundamental freedom. This is why sometimes you have seen some of the UNESCO say that it can be seen like a cultural cleansing in some of the places, like we have seen. And of course, as a result of these events across the globe, an average of 69 million people are affected by displacement, and of this, almost 20 million of are refugees, and 60% of them live in cities. So when you observe this urban distress, there is a need, of course, to address them by some responses that can consider the need of all the social groups and provide opportunities for social inclusion and economic development, while, of course, trying to acknowledge the needs, the priorities, and the identities of the communities. And for this reason, both of our organizations believe that through culture, through cultural heritage and creativity is essential as both an asset and a tool for city reconstruction and the recovery. And of course, if culture is not placed at the core of urban reconstruction and recovery strategies, we think that reconstruction process can induce additional disruption of physical and social fabric. The approach that we adopted, was quite an intensive one, of course. As I said, it didn't come from our books only, it came from our experience and our different projects. And then the framework that we try to propose, that we are proposing, as I said, is a culture-based approach to the process of this city and reconstruction and recovery. In fact, what we try to do is to provide a kind of roadmap for post-crisis economic development and also the management of complex social, spatial, and economic transformation, while at the same time we try to address the shortcomings of the most pressing needs, if I can put it like this. And the framework actually draws, like I said, on existing frameworks and tools for reconstruction and recovery in urban settings. And this is important. And this framework, we called it, as you can see in the screen, we call it the CURE framework. It says by its name. What we did is that we developed some background papers and a number of case studies which allowed us to draw on some global experience since the World War period to demonstrate progressing how this has progressed in the ground, but also through a number of consultations with different experts around the world and some of those who wrote some of the papers. Let me say just a few words about the case studies, and then I will leave the floor to Same. When you look at this slide, which is in front of you, you see some key messages. And these key messages you see on the screen are also highlighted in the position paper, and of course, other experience. If I can take some of them, like for example, leveraging cultural tourism to boost local development, which is important, or in Timbuktu, engaging communities in the restoration of heritage to foster social cohesion and reconciliation. And or in Tokyo, where it was also clear to us that this case demonstrates how city as a cultural construct approach coupled with innovative land readjustment mechanisms can result in a resilient city, making it flourish today against many considerable odds. And if we can take again the case of Seoul, which is also important, we've been trying to bring together these different experience and case studies to come up with what we can see, not only on some of the past cases, but also on some of the cases in which we are going to work in the future due to the damage that we are observing, be it in Syria, be it in Iran, in Iraq, or also in Iraq and in Syria and in Yemen also. And we also build on our experience that we had recently, not only the past one, but recently also in Timbuktu. So this is, in a way, the context in which we try to put together this position paper. So I think for the rest, I'd like to pass the floor to Sami.
Okay, merci Lazare. We're going to just switch places because of the positioning of the microphone. And I forgot to mention that Lazare is Director for Culture and Emergencies at UNESCO, so he's the ideal person to be making this presentation. Same, over to you.
Yes, so I think what we've looked at really is the existing frameworks. Of course, you have the series of disaster management frameworks, anywhere from the Yokohama Strategy, evolving to Hyogo, and then to Sendai with the emphasis on Build Back Better. You have, the two foundational instruments that we use in terms of post-disaster needs assessment, in terms of the rapid peace-building assessment that we use to underpin our interventions in a post-disaster context or a post-conflict context. And of course, you have UNESCO's Historic Urban Landscape Recommendation, which promotes an integrated approach to managing heritage resources found in historic cities, but taking into consideration that it's a dynamic urban context. So these were some of the frameworks that we looked at, and as Lazar has mentioned, it was about adapting a framework that could really underpin culture as the foundation on which reconstruction and recovery would work. So in looking at these frameworks, one of the things we've observed is that it's not always that reconstruction and recovery strategy are always aligned. Sometimes they end up being divergent. Sometimes the trade-off between the need to intervene on an emergency basis in the short term can be in contrast to the foundations you need to build for a medium and long-term process of resilient recovery. The two time frames might be at odds, the priorities can be at odds. So what we really wanted to emphasize are really very two simple things. One is to say culture is the driver and the enabler of the post-crisis reconstruction and recovery, that it informs the critical actions that are taken, both on state building, institution buildings, but also the reconciliation process in context of conflict. And the second foundation is that culture will underpin this integrated approach that combines both place-based and people-based strategy. That's more or less the framework that you see over here, and let me deconstruct it a little bit for you. But maybe I'll use an example from another sector to give you an idea about why, we think that sometimes place-based and people-based strategies might be at odds. Take, for instance, the housing sector. If you're trying to design interventions to support access to housing for a population, you might decide to say, we are going to proceed with a people-based approach. In this case, a people-based approach will revolve around choice of the people. So you will probably offer housing vouchers. That's basically a payment to allow the household to choose where it wants to go and live. So instead of investing in a housing unit, you're investing in the family obtaining a subsidy that they carry with them, and they find the home ownership or the rental opportunity where they choose to live. The advantage, of course, it's pro-choice. It is demand-driven. It responds to what people need. The disadvantage is it turns it back on existing neighborhoods. It does not invest in any given place. It invests to where people want to go. You take the opposite approach, which is a place-based strategy. One example would be slum upgrading. So you have places, that are suffering from disinvestment in housing, in infrastructure, and you can invest in the place. You can improve the neighborhoods. You can make them better places to live. The advantage is, of course, there's some cost in those neighborhoods. So you are turning around places. The disadvantage, somebody can come and tell you, you're ghettoizing poverty, meaning you're still investing in the same place and poor people continue to live together and they have no chance to move, let's say, to a better neighborhood or to where they might want to live. So as you can see, each approach, whether it's a place-based or a people-based, first, there's no one solution fits all. Probably it's a combination of both. But what you need, therefore, is in order to reconcile those two approaches, the place-based solutions and the people-based solutions, is this emphasis that we try to bring, which is the need to embed culture at the core. Meaning that for place-based solutions, we need to put people at the center of place-based solution. So as you are investing in places, it's about ensuring that the communities participate in prioritizing the needs, the communities participate in overseeing the, if you will, the selection of the contractors, the overseeing the construction process, contributing to the operation and maintenance, and the communities also owning the assets. So the moment you start putting people at the center of a strategy that focuses on place, you are transforming, if you will, its destiny. By the same token, it's the opposite. As you start looking at a place, at a people-based strategy, and these are usually strategies that are meant for, if you will, the economic recovery of households. It's about livelihoods. It's about socioeconomic recovery. The moment you embed a sense of place in the middle of these strategies, by that I mean, an emphasis on, as you're trying, for instance, to inject money into a community post-disaster, you're trying to provide cash for works, you're trying to provide whatever type of a solution that can inject livelihoods. So the emphasis on traditional building material and traditional crafts, being able to embed a sense of identity and a sense of culture and a sense of place in the middle of those people-based solutions is what's needed to ensure that those people-based, if you will, strategies focusing on recovery are also instilled in place. So it's by integrating people at the center of place-based strategies, by integrated a sense of place in the middle of people-based strategy, is basically a tantamount of ensuring that culture underpins the process. I mean, there's nothing revolutionary in what we're trying to say. I mean, it's sustainable development if you want. But I think what we've noticed is that, much of the frameworks out there, much of the guidance that's out there does not really underpin that. Now, the other thing that we wanted to do is first, as Lazar mentioned, we've done a series of in-depth case studies to try to understand how have different cities emerging from a post-disaster or emerging from a post-conflict situation have managed to tackle these dimensions, and what did we learn from that? So the first thing is we've uncovered that there are 7 more or less principles that emerged from what worked well or what we inferred from what did not work well. The first and obvious one is to acknowledge that the city is a cultural construct, which basically built spaces, the unbuilt spaces, the open spaces, and the social fabric are interwoven. We've also noticed from a case, for instance, like Sarajevo, that when you jumpstart the reconciliation process in a post-conflict setting by focusing on building or rebuilding the societal landmarks, the cultural landmarks, there is a better chance for success in the process. Of course, you will all know the the Mostar bridge case in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was the bridge that stitched together 2 communities that went together into conflict. It's not only a connector and an access to economic opportunities, but it is also, if you will, the bridge that fostered this cohesion between those 2 communities. And here are communities that prioritize the reconstruction of this Mostar Bridge landmark over the construction of their own housing when they were asked to prioritize what's needed to get past this conflict. Fostering cultural expressions to offer appropriate ways of dealing with post-conflict trauma and crises is particularly important. I mean, you face that in a lot of communities, and in the aftermath of a particularly devastated conflict, being able to allow for that multiplicity of cultural expressions, for the identities of the community to underpin this reconstruction process is critical. Ensuring that culture is embedded throughout the entire value chain of the process, starting from the early planning process, the post-disaster, post-crisis needs assessment, all the way to planning, financing, and implementation. And I'll go a bit more into detail in that. Ensuring that communities and local governments, so it's not just the, if you will, elected representative, but the community at large, are consulted and participate actively in every step of the process. Looking at financial solutions across a range of instruments, meaning, what is needed for the immediate and short-term reconstruction or recovery is going to be different from the instrument or financial instruments and models that could underpin a more medium to long term. We've looked at a range of things from, of course, if you will, donor funding and concessional funding to instruments like land value capture, etc., that could ensure that, for instance, as you're urbanizing land, part of the proceeds of this land value can go into financing infrastructure. And finally, it's ensuring, if you will, balancing 2 time frames. What is needed for the immediate emergency interventions, its shelter solutions, clean water, etc., with what's needed for the medium and long-term recovery of the historic character of a given place. And that particular challenge is most obvious today in the city of Mosul. The people are returning back to their city. It's a historic city, and people are keen to rebuild and rebuild really fast their housing. Whatever housing is going to get rebuilt, the balancing of these actions, you cannot tell, the Iraqis, please stay put. We're going to have to restore the full, technique to reproduce exactly the historic housing as it used to be. We need to do the studies because nobody's going to listen to you. And at the same time, you want to also resist the tendency of, you just put in concrete and just build anything. So that it's a balancing act. I don't think there's a particular blueprint on how to do it, but you have to be both responsive to the urgency with also ensuring that the character of place is not compromised over the long term. And this is where the historic urban landscape approach matters. So in the different phases, this is to ensure that culture, first, is not a sector. It's not about looking at the museums and cultural heritage sites. It is something that underpins every pillar of a damage and needs assessment. It's the analysis of community fabric, and it's also mainstreamed across the various different sectors. It's the scoping process, the visioning of how the community wants to rebuild their city in a post-disaster or a post-conflict, the policies and strategies, and the financing and implementation. Now, one of the things that we've looked at is, it's not a linear process. It's not, you finish the damage and needs assessment, you start the scoping, you finish the scoping, you start the policies, and so on. It's an iterative process, and it goes back and forth between the steps. It's about the whole city. We're not here only talking about restoring character of the historic area, but about looking at the entire city and the entire urban fabric. And as I've mentioned, is ensuring that you have the appropriate levels of consultation and the balancing between rapid response and what's needed for medium and long-term recovery. I really want to emphasize there's nothing, there's no rocket science in what we're trying to say over here. It really is a process. It makes sense, and it's something that you'll find that we strive as development practitioners to ensure it happens. It's just that the tensions that you have on the ground, the scarcity of resources, the rush to rebuild, might be the types of dynamic that or the political economy that one operates in. It's ensuring that communities in the aftermath of a conflict, it's not one winner and one loser. It's, in a post-disaster, it's also restoring the place. So there's a lot of, we encourage you to read, our position paper. There's a lot of case studies. This draws on a lot of work that has happened on the ground. At the end of the day, the three basic messages: culture playing a key role in post-crisis reconstruction and recovery, that it should be seen as that foundation that integrates both the people-centered and the place-based approaches, and that for it to produce effective outcomes, we really have to think about mainstreaming culture across the entire value chain, meaning starting from the needs assessment, the scoping, but then the planning, the implementation, and the financing. Thank you very much. And of course, we recognize that GFDRR was a great supporter, and we have a series of dissemination and follow-up technical notes, and we invite your inputs in that. Sorry, John.
And if you're nice to Sami, he has a few copies of the framework that both he and Lazar will sign for you, right? So I was just thinking when Sami and Lazar were talking how important culture is. When it struck me after the Indian Ocean tsunami, I was in Banda Aceh, and the first thing that was rebuilt there, it wasn't the roads, it wasn't the ports, it wasn't the housing, it was the main mosque. And that was such a building of inspiration for people. It conveyed hope, it conveyed a sense of reconstruction for the future, and it was a place for the community to gather. So that is when I first appreciated the value of culture in the recovery process. Let's move on now to a couple of very concrete examples of how this framework has been applied in the real world. And we have one example that's built around a natural disaster, and the other example that comes from a conflict situation. So I'd like to ask Setsuko Saya to tell us about the case of the Kumamoto Castle. I'm interested because I was at the castle before the disaster, and so I want to see how the process of reconstruction went. So Setsuko is the Director for International Cooperation in the Disaster Management Bureau of the Cabinet Office in Japan, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you very much for coming to this session. I think it's a very interesting session, excited, and congratulations for the launching of this report. And thank you for your presentation, and I can't agree with you more when you concluded that the culture should be the foundation to make people-centered, place-based approach and make this attractiveness of cities can be enhanced through this reconstruction of culture. And I'm very happy to share the Japan's perfect example of reconstruction of Kumamoto Castle by showing it's about the earthquake occurred in 2016. And this earthquake was very critical, maybe the most critical earthquake after the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake that killed more than 200 people. And magnitude 6 and 7 earthquake occurred successively, and then damaged 200,000 buildings in the Kumamoto region. So this is about how it occurred and damaged the Kumamoto area. It's a shopping arcade. And about the castle. This castle was built in 1607, more than 400 years ago. But after the first construction, it was damaged several times because of fire, because of war, and then it was rebuilt. This photo was the rebuilt castle, 1960, and it is very beautiful, and it is the kind of main building of the castle. It is located in the top of the hill, and the basement was given. Basement is made of stone wall. So it's on the top of the hill and made of stone wall. So I think this very beautiful structure can be seen everywhere from the urban center in Kumamoto. And this is, of course, the symbol of Kumamoto City, and it is the heart of Kumamoto people. The location of this castle is in the middle of the city center. You can see in the right bottom, the city hall, and in front of that is a very huge park center on the castle. And castle itself is it's not just one building. It has many buildings that is related to the castle's function. And then it is a park where people will hang around, and it's a beautiful place, and it is, of course, the tourism attraction places. But very unfortunately, because of the earthquake, this was damaged. Especially this main building was damaged because the tile was on the roof. The roof is made of tile, and the tile fell off because of the second earthquake, and also the stone walls was broken like that. It's very sad to see this such a beautiful castle was broken, and of course people lost many things during the earthquake, people's lives and buildings and their assets, but also they lost the soul of the Kumamoto. That was the most sad thing for the people, and people shared such a sadness, not only for the people in Kumamoto, but all Japanese or any other people who have seen the beautiful structure before. So it was very sad. So this is the Build Back Better planning by the Kumamoto Prefecture. The governor explained that the Kumamoto's reconstructions should be built back better because people want more from the reconstruction processes. And then the governor identified 2 priority areas, and one of it is the reconstruction of the castle. And Kumamoto City announced the Kumamoto Castle's reconstruction plan in 1980. Kumamoto reconstruction plan in 2018, which is 2 years after the earthquake. I think one of the lessons, or something I can share with this CURE program, is that this is not about the reconstruction of the castle. It is related to it is a part of the reconstruction of the city itself, because the Kumamoto City reconstruction plan is the upper level planning beyond this Kumamoto Castle reconstruction plan. And also it is related with a plan for tourism and plan for urban redevelopment plan. So it is not about the standalone how to restore the castle, but it is also related to how to use the restored castle in the future in the part of the city's planning. And this castle reconstruction plan is a very long-term plan. It's a 20 years plan, but the 20 years plan is still, they call it as a mid-term, because it envisages 100 years ahead, because that culture will stay for 400 years at least, so it will continue for more than 100 years on the head. But still, they want something to restore quickly, which is the main castle, main building. So they make it as a short-term vision to make the main building to restore within quickly, because it is a part of and it is a symbol of the Kumamoto people. They want to restore the identity quickly, so they make it as a first 5 years plan, but they have a lot to do with the midterm and then beyond the 100 years. This is all things are written in the reconstruction planning. As I explained, the midterm, they build the main castle as a symbol, and other buildings are left as a midterm planning. And without waiting for 20 years to open the castle, they started opening the castle reconstruction process to the public already. It's a limited access, but it has been already made it to the public, and people can see the reconstruction process itself from inside the castle. And then they have to restore the park itself, because the surroundings have to be also coordinated with the reconstruction of the castle itself. And very interesting thing is the cutting-edge technology is used, because it has to be anti-earthquake structure, because Kumamoto knew that they are very prone to earthquake, so there might be another earthquake in the future. So even during the process of reconstruction, it has to be stayed anti-earthquake structure. So a lot of cutting-edge technology for the architecture was used. They even made the stone wall to be anti-earthquake structure. I don't know how, but there must be a lot of technology to be used for this structure. And also very interesting thing is about the training of craftsmen for traditional architects, because this castle used very ancient technology to build this tall building happen, even in the technologies of the 17th century. The modern architects do not know about how to make it, so it's a kind of the lessons. They need to know how to build the castle with using only the technologies of the 17th century, and then they need to practice it by using the reconstruction process as an experience to learn how to do so. And in the long term, they wanted as a kind of symbol to communicate the occurrence of the earthquake in the future generation. And now it looks like that it gradually started the reconstruction. It is still the beginning of the reconstruction, and then they make it as a kind of very great. I think it's not. It looks like making a tower or something, and then it's in the December. But now the kind of the structure in the main building was already finished, and then now they move on to the adjacent buildings like that. The reconstruction process was made to the public. I explained. The city wanted the citizens to be part of the reconstruction, so they make available the access to the reconstruction process, and also they asked donation from the citizens, small donation, so that, and then people who donated it can name themselves as owner of the castle. So it's a nice thing, it's very nice. I forgot to mention, but it costs a lot to do the reconstruction. So donation itself is not enough, but they are now doing a lot of promotion to make this fund available. And another success of this Kumamoto's case is they have a very nice communication strategy by using this kumamon. Kuma means bear in Japanese, and Kumamon was born in 2010 as he's a bear. He's a bear, and he can talk and walk around. And he was assigned as the Director General of City Promotion of the Kumamoto Prefecture. And so the right-hand side gentleman is the governor, and the bear is always with the governor, and they try to promote the attractiveness of Kumamoto. And after the earthquake, the bear was so successful for communicating what happened in Kumamoto and attracting many attention from all over the country. And people love this Kumamon so much, people will donate by purchasing the Kumamon's puppet or Kumamon something. He has a copyright, so he's making a lot of money. Yeah. And Kumamon can travel to many places. When I, as a cabinet office, hosted a public event, I invited him, and then he attracted so many fans. So it's kind of symbolic to the reconstruction itself. And he even went to London to make a kind of promotion of the Kumamoto prefecture itself. So I think that was a very successful case, how they can communicate about the reconstruction process itself so that people have some attachment to it, even though people who have never been to Kumamoto will knew something about it. And like he got fan letters from many children and how children love Kumamon, how children feel attached to the reconstruction of Kumamoto and reconstruction of castle. I think your report is perfect to demonstrate how culture helps people to rebuild people's identity. And I think the Kumamoto Castle is also a very good case to demonstrate the role of culture and how it contributes to attractiveness of the urban redevelopment. And also it helps for the people it helps to communicate to the future generation about this castle because it will stay forever, and then the castle remains to be the process of the reconstruction for more than 100 years. Thank you very much for your thank you very much.
Thank you, Sai-san. I think we're going to have to draw on Japanese technical assistance to develop a mascot for the next WRC. So please help us with that. Now we'll pass to Texan John Lim. Texan is the Director of Rehabilitation and Recovery Management Services with the Office of Civil Defense in the Philippines. And we're going to get to see not only the presentation, but also a video that was shown to the cabinet or the president?
Yes, to the president.
To the president.
Recently.
Yeah. Over to you.
Okay. Sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry. I think this is fine. Thank you very much. Again, our thanks to GFDRR for arranging this and for arranging us to share with everyone our experiences now with the Marawi siege. I think it is very timely, considering what you mentioned earlier about post-conflict and the need to use culture in helping or facilitating the recovery process. So I'll quickly discuss our outline. Oh, I'm sorry. Allow me first to recognize our ambassador for the mission to Geneva is here, Ambassador Garcia, as well as our undersecretary from the Department of Social Welfare and Development, Ma'am Luz Vilaga. So going back, my outline will be very quick. My presentation will be very quick, except for the video, which I'll try to shorten. We have a video presentation of the Marawi siege recovery, and then I'll quickly discuss the concept behind the Marawi rehabilitation, some of the challenges, because the video might come off as too positive, so it puts things into proper perspective. And I'll skip this whole part about the housing projects. And as promised to World Bank, we'd quickly discuss a little bit of the developments, key disaster rehabilitation recovery developments in the Philippines, particularly with the creation of the OCD's RMS, the Rehabilitation Recovery Management Service, and the crafting of the first ever world country disaster recovery planning guide, which was done with the World Bank. So before going there, let me quickly shift to the video. Where did the video go?
Does the video explain what happened in Marawi?
Yes.
It does.
Yes. I think he didn't copy the video. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry, I'm running down the time. This may wake us up a bit.
I hereby declare Marawi City liberated from the terrorist influence that marks the beginning of rehabilitation of the people.
Since the liberation, the President has issued Administrative Order Number 9, creating the Task Force Bangon Marawi, or TFBM. With a whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach, TFBM has been at the forefront in the recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction of Marawi. To further improve its services for Marawi, internally displaced persons, or IDPs, TFBM implemented the Katanor, a biometrics-based profiling of the IDPs.
The primary reason why we conducted the profiling or Katanor is to ensure that only credible residents will be profiled.
From the 37,479 figure, 15,727 families are from Marawi's most affected area, or MAA, while 21,752 families are from outside the MAA. TFBM member agencies and humanitarian organizations are now using the Katanor data to ensure that support and intervention are provided only to legitimate Marawi IDPs. TFBM Subcommittee on Housing, led by the Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council and the National Housing Authority, continues to build temporary shelters for the displaced families. To date, a total of 1,608 displaced families from evacuation centers inside and outside Marawi City are now living in temporary shelters. The Buganga, or Lakeview Transitory Site, with a total of 1,500 temporary shelter units, will be completed within this year. Simultaneously being constructed are 1,000 temporary shelter units at Rorogagu's transitory site. Funded by both NHA and San Miguel Foundation, the construction of Pamayandeng Saranao residences is also ongoing in Barangay Kilala, with more than 2,000 permanent housing units, a marketplace, health center, livelihood hall, and a multipurpose hall. The Subcommittee on Reconstruction, headed by the Department of Public Works and Highways, is in charge of repairing the damaged public buildings, bridges, and roads. One of the highlights of the subcommittee's contribution in the Marawi rehabilitation is the start of Marawi Transcentral Road Contract Packages 1B and 2 this year. DPWH Secretary Mark Villar, HUDCC Secretary Eduardo Del Rosario, and Japanese Ambassador to the Philippines Koji Haneda led the groundbreaking of the project last February 4, 2019, held at the Lanao del Sur provincial capital in Marawi City. While the task force is doubling its efforts in the ongoing physical rehabilitation of Marawi City, the Subcommittee on Health and Social Welfare, co-chaired by Department of Social Welfare and Development and the Department of Health, assures the continuous provision of relief assistance, family food packs, sustainable livelihood programs, cash for work assistance and emergency assistance, including constant health response, psychosocial intervention, and livelihood trainings for Marawi residents, with a commitment of full support to the recovery of Marawi. True to the TFBM promise, during the consultations with MAA residents in March 2019, distribution of 73,000 pesos cash assistance to MAA residents started on April 6 and continues to this day. The Office of Civil Defense led the distribution to 947 IDP families of family packs, consisting of hygiene kits, kitchenware, and sleeping gears. Each family food pack costs 11,000 pesos. The different member agencies of the Subcommittee on Business and Livelihood, led by the Department of Trade and Industry, continue to pour livelihood assistance and support to the IDPs through the monthly kawiyagan, livelihood distribution, and conversions with other humanitarian organizations. since 2017, has distributed 3,052 sewing machines with starter cloths, 500 bigasan kits, grocery packs, sari-sari store starter kits, carpentry tool kits, electronic tool kits, carinderia kits, starter kits for Maranao delicacies, street foods, and food carts from United Nations Development Program with bike and ingredients.
Salamat po sa DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, sa pamimigay nila ng sari-sari store sa amin bilang umpisa ng aming pangkabuhayan.
The Technical Education and Skills Development Authority conducted enrollment for skills training on cookery, bread and pastry, dressmaking, computer system servicing, electrical installation and maintenance, shielded metal arc welding, carpentry, and masonry. The Department of Science and Technology launched the skills training on do-it-yourself bamboo shelter production and the establishment of a corn mill to benefit the locals of Butig, Lanao del Sur, and home-based IDPs from Marawi City. DOST also conducted a series of training on personal care products, charcoal briquetting, herbal processing, and essential oil extraction to build sustainable livelihood for the IDPs of Marawi. The Subcommittee on Land Resource Management, headed by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, continues its quest for a land conflict-free Marawi. As part of the primary component of the Bangon Marawi Comprehensive Rehabilitation and Recovery Program, the debris management inside the 24 barangay most affected area is swiftly taking place. There are still 49 unexploded ordnances buried under the debris, which are still being located and disposed by the Explosive Ordnance and Disposal Team of the Armed Forces of the Philippines and Reconstruction. TFBM also created the Interagency Committee on Debris Clearing, led by NHA, to handle the demolition and make sure that the guidelines are strictly observed inside the MAA. A total of 390 structures are now being demolished before the actual reconstruction of infrastructures. Debris management, including retrieval of unexploded ordnances and improvised explosive devices in the most affected area, is being conducted and is targeted to be finished in 8 months. By November 30, the debris clearing operations will be completed.
By July, pwede na makabalik yung mga residente na mag-repair, mag-construct ng kanilang mga building.
Once the most affected area is cleared of debris, the construction of roads, utilities, school buildings, health facilities, central market, port facilities, and other public infrastructures will commence. The Subcommittee for Peace and Order, co-chaired by the Department of Interior and Local Government and the Department of National Defense, continues to ensure that the peace and order in public services in Marawi City are restored. As the recovery and rehabilitation of the city is on top of the priorities, the security sector vows to continue protecting the residents against another attack by violent extremists and delivers social cohesion programs to achieve the whole of nation approach. The military also tightens the security measures against violent extremists to prevent future attacks of communities. Lastly, from the battlefield, the military also vows to continue civil and military operations in support of the Marawi City recovery efforts. The Task Force Bangon Marawi and its member agencies are working hand in hand to respond to the needs and concerns of the Maranaos. TFBM ensures that no one is left behind in accessing government services. The Department of Finance has estimated the reconstruction and rehabilitation of Marawi City, Butig, and Piagapo for over a 5-year period to cost the government 60.51 billion pesos. TFBM continues the transparent operations by engaging with local and international media in helping the government inform and update the general public, especially the Marawi IDPs, on the government rehabilitation efforts.
And we will follow strictly the instruction of the President to ensure that Marawi will be prosperous.
Okay, thank you, Texan. So that was the rosy public relations
Yes.
view. Now tell us the real story.
But before I do so, Joe, allow me to just highlight how our country actually has recognized the importance of culture in recovery. Even in the RISE plan actually the RISE actually does have meanings. R stands for resilience, I identity, S for sustainability, E for evolution. Now, in amongst all of the four, we have identified that it is the cultural identity of Marawi City that is most important. It is important to mention that Marawi City, while the Philippines is actually predominantly Catholic or Christian, Marawi City is the premier Islamic city in the Philippines. So it means a lot for all the Muslims in the Philippines, particularly in the Mindanao region. So this we can see even in the whole of nation approach with social inclusion through culture, even with our partnerships with our organizations as PDRF, they have made sure that all of their projects are connected to the culture of the Maranaos, the Muslim Maranaos in Marawi City. Of course, there's also a lot of consultations, particularly even to the imams, the religious leaders. There are even some work that we are doing relative to policy called fatwas that are not law by nature, but are religious principles that actually are helping, particularly in the field of water. So even in the reconstruction of buildings, as you can see here on the screen, most of the designs are primarily Islamic in nature. So here is the real picture. No, not real, but the challenges rather that we are facing. It is not an easy task, we have to admit. We have now, over the first year and a half, we had to overcome a lot of legal challenges, but having gone through that, we are still faced with the challenges of clearing of unexploded explosives and ordinances. At the moment, we still have 49 unexploded ordinances. We have 3 500-pounders, 13 260 pounds, and 33 110-pounders. Just to visualize, that explosion that a 500-pounder would cause would be about 650 meters in radius. The whole area of the Marawi City Central Business District, which was destroyed during the siege, it covers about 250 hectares of land. So we also have the problem with land ownership. There are, of course, multiple claimants, and with even the government as one of them. It's built over titles. Then, of course, there is the need to get the consent to demolish houses and buildings. Given that this is a very sensitive situation, the government has deemed it not to bother with or not to pressure into taking the properties directly, but are respecting them first and then identifying who the owners may be. But in any case, even with the prospective owners or the claimants, we have only gotten about 766 who agreed for the demolition of their houses out of the 6,435. Then, of course, there's the need of the profiling of resident beneficiaries. There's actually been a big stumbling block that we first encountered, as there was a lot of there were peoples who were claiming to be in displaced persons who were actually not. So we have began this process with through the assistance of World Bank, called the Cathanor, or the identification of people, where we are doing biometrics and other picture taking and other getting other data to properly identify our beneficiaries. And of course, there is the political challenges. There are a lot of clamor right now for people to return back into the most affected area despite public safety issues. And of course, there is even attacks in the media all over internationally about how the city is a ghost town, despite the fact that it was not. And here's a quick timeline. We are targeting by 2021 to at least complete the infrastructure projects and some of the social infrastructure projects. Now, quickly moving on, as to the recent milestones in the disaster rehabilitation and recovery in the Philippines, which is led by the Department the National Economic and Development Authority, and co-assisted or assisted by the Office of Civil Defense, where our goal is turning disasters into opportunities. For those who may not know, the Philippines we do not have a disaster department, a disaster management department. What we do have is a National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, which is headed by the Department of National Defense. And for recovery, the vice chair is the National Economic and Development Authority. So in 2016, I think this is a very big milestone. From lessons learned from Yolanda and our past experiences in other disasters, the Office of Civil Defense Rehabilitation and Recovery Management Service was created. Right now, we already have a strength of 26 and is constantly growing. So as you can see here in the organizational structure of the Office of Civil Defense, this new service has been created. It initially had we do have only 2 divisions at the moment, which is concerned with managing the disaster management, disaster fund, and doing post-disaster needs assessments. But we already have direction towards strengthening our disaster rehabilitation recovery policy development, recovery planning, which includes, of course, updating these plans, disaster program monitoring, evaluation, and reporting, and deeper fund management, all towards achieving resilient recovery. Now, another milestone that we just recently had was an NARMC resolution that was made last March 20 of this year, where we came out, where the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council approved our Disaster Rehabilitation and Recovery Planning Guide, which was based on the GFDRR and EU document in 2015 in disaster recovery frameworks, as well as the ASEAN document that was crafted by UNDP in 2016, also as to disaster recovery frameworks. This was done with the assistance of the World Bank. Thank you very much. And of course, with the participation of different CSOs, our private partners here, PDRF, who is also here, and local governments and other stakeholders. This, we're proud to say, is the first ever country contextualized disaster rehabilitation and recovery planning guide. Now, basically, these are the chapters. It provides for the framework, and then it provides for the planning process and plan structure, highlighting, of course, pre-disaster planning as well as post-disaster. As I attended one of the sessions earlier, and as they said, one of the key activities in disaster recovery is planning for recovery. So, of course, there is institutional arrangements, stating forth the roles of stakeholders, implementation mechanisms, and the monitoring and evaluation process. So it serves as a reference for government agencies and LGUs in pre-disaster planning and post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery. It suggests baseline data requirements. It provides for a guide in coordination amongst between the national, regional, or subnational, and other local DRMCs, as well as other sectors. And here is the general framework where our long-term goal is always, of course, to create safer, adaptive, and disaster-resilient Filipino communities. We'd like to show, as you beautifully mentioned earlier, that cultural sensitivity and social inclusivity is not a particular sector, but it's a cross-cutting issue. We have recognized that, and we are really, truly trying to make sure that such is met during our disaster recovery. And as last, there is a specific provision there on cultural sensitivity. With that, thank you very much, and mabuhay po kayong lahat. Sorry, that was pretty long. Thank you.
Salma, it was long, but it was interesting, I thought. So we were going to have kind of a moderated discussion, but what I'd like to do now is we have about 10 minutes left for questions from the floor. And I see a question way in the back, 2 questions. Maybe you could just come up towards the front. Or you got a microphone. Okay, that's good.
Sure, thank you.
Tell us who you are and your institutional affiliation.
My name is Ashat Kalitz. I work at the Croatian Center for Cultural Innovation. And I work actually on research on how to make cultures resilient in both ways. How cultures can make communities resilient and how communities make cultures. So this presentation was really interesting for me. And I was also curious about one thing that was not mentioned, and just a hint. There is a body of research, especially in the last 5 years or so, about how security and culture interconnect. And based on that and some other findings, for example, Germany some years ago, they abandoned their policy of multi-culti and things like that. So what I'm curious about, how do you deal with communities like cities that are culturally diverse, especially when the communities within the city, especially because a lot of immigration into the cities, actually do not communicate. But the city is basically a collection of different cultures that are pretty much separate. They just share a space. Thank you.
Let's take one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the panel.
Hi, my name is Peter Lowy. I'm institutionally affiliated with the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, although I also happened to have been doing a PhD in architecture and construction before leaving it to do policy. Kind of to expand on the question that just came before, a lot of what happens, especially in post-conflict cities, is that you see specific cultures are targeted for being that culture. And when you kind of destroy multiple cultures at the same time and then only selectively rebuild, how are you dealing with the with essentially the promoting one culture over another in this reconstruction? And then kind of sub-question to that, I'm thinking, of course, of examples of how do you finance that, thinking of how Notre Dame has already raised $1 billion to reconstruct, and yet Malawi cannot get some 10 million to reconstruct after Cyclone Idai. So how do you balance selective reconstruction, and then how do you finance ensuring that you are actually reconstructing for all and those that need it most? Thank you.
Thanks. Let me repackage those. The first question, I think, from both of our questioners is how do we deal with cities that are culturally diverse, and how do we avoid bias in the reconstruction process? And then the second question I was going to ask myself, $570 million for Kumamoto Castle. That's even for Japan a lot of money. 60 billion pesos for the Philippines is quite significant. How do we mobilize this finance for investing in recovery after disasters and conflicts in cities? How did you do it? So who wants to take the multicultural question?
I think I will. I think that there's something which we are convinced following our joint cooperation. It's that I think what is important is to make sure that you understand the specificity of a city and the way it was reflected in the life of the people before the destruction. And I think in trying to assess the damages, it's not about assessing the physical damages of the city, but it's also about assessing its cultural characteristics that are important. I think by trying to select the approach and the type of culture to rebuild, you are not targeting the city as an inclusive space. I think it's important, and this is what we are trying to put in our position paper. It's not about selecting, it's about having an inclusive approach, taking into consideration all the diverse cultural identities. And when I was in Mosul last week, and I can speak about Mosul, Mosul is not only, I mean, you have to look at the different layers of the history, not look at the current situation of Mosul. Mosul, even during the Mesopotamian period, has been a Christian place, a Muslim place. And I think the city, the way it looked before the destruction, was representing this diversity with churches, with some churches which became mosques. And I think it's important to get, if you want to get Mosul you want to help the people recover from this trauma and this distressing situation, I think it's important to consider all the different cultural landmarks that characterizes the people. This is also the way you're bringing them back in the city. And this is the effort that we need to make. At least this is what we're trying to promote, not only at UNESCO, but also in our position paper.
Okay, thanks. Texan, maybe you could tackle a little bit about this cultural diversity and bias, but also talk about the financing dimension in the Philippines.
Well, of course, Marawi City is generally, I think, 90% Muslim, or even more, and with only the remaining part as being Christian, right? At this point in time, what's beautiful about sorry for using the word beautiful in a reconstruction or a post-disaster, is that indeed there are really opportunities for us to actually build back better, not only the infrastructure but the social infrastructure. What do I mean by this? In the past, there was really some kind of it was really hard for Christians to be living in Marawi to some extent, as well as, of course, Muslims working outside, living outside. But with what happened to Marawi City, with, of course, the rest of the Philippines now coming in and helping out, the trust level between Muslims and Christians are actually improving. To such extent, we have actually been successful in creating that kind of relationship. It's just that I can't so much answer on the part as to rebuilding mosques and churches, in a sense that in the Philippines, our constitution does not allow us to do so. We have a non-establishment clause which prevents us from building religious edifices. But what we have been trying to do is, like, we have some other countries, Muslim countries and donors who would like to rebuild the mosque. So we, instead of accepting the donations directly as a government, we are trying to redirect them directly to the communities for the rebuilding of the mosques, which is, of course, something that we actually, again, really push for. As for the disaster recovery financing, generally, the Philippines has a system under our disaster law where we have this National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Fund, which actually serves as a buffer for the entire budgetary process. It's a fund where we can actually use, it's a fund where we can now fund projects for disasters that have occurred or within a 2-year period from the point the disaster happens. Though in this particular case of Marawi, it's of course it's a matter of government policy. The Baon Marawi Comprehensive Rehabilitation Recovery Plan does identify where all the fundings will come from. And of course, it includes the fund I mentioned earlier. You have the regular agency budgets. You have grants and donations. And of course, the counterparts from the local governments. This actually has been properly pursuant, of course, that recovery guide that we actually came up with from lessons learned even from Marawi and other disasters, like I mentioned. Everything was actually properly programmed. So that is actually the beauty of our council system, is that while of course the coordination takes time to build, later on with the Department of Finance there, the Department of Budget and Management, we do meet a lot to try and properly make sure that the funding is there.
And Saya-san, what about the case of Kumamoto Castle? Kumamon royalties can only go so far in mobilizing the resources. Where do you get the rest of the funding, especially for that 100-year vision?
That's right. So the reconstruction is huge amount of funding, but still, it's not the money that we need now. It will be a long-term vision to create the resources, financial resources over the 20 years. And reconstruction itself, of course, Kumamon is making a lot of copyright money, but still, the reconstruction of the castle requires the new technological development or new employment that creates economic growth. So it is not only about the money that we need now, the money we will create by reconstructing the castle. So I think, and of course they are asking more donation from individual persons, not a big donation, but small donation from many people. I think in the long-term perspective might be necessary.
Okay, thanks. I have good news and bad news. The bad news is we're going to have to close the session. So I'm sure that there are more questions out there, but the panelists, if they could stay around for a few minutes, would be happy, I think, to answer you directly with any questions that you might have. The good news is that I understand you've been evaluated as a great audience, and so you're invited to the reception. It'll be starting at, I think, 6 o'clock. So it gives you a little time to freshen up, relax, and then come upstairs, and we're very happy to offer you a drink and a bite to eat. So let's have a round of applause for our panelists. And thank you. We look forward to seeing you at the second day of the WRC tomorrow.